The early 90s were tough for the industry. Some even describe the era as a second crash, with plenty of money lost on unsuccessful ventures. Several firms brought out new hardware trying to steal the crown from Nintendo and Sega. The Atari Jaguar, Bandai Pippin and Playdia, Fujitsu Marti, Amiga CD32 and of course the 3DO were all regarded as failures. But in some cases, this judgment is unfair. The 3DO had great potential. It introduced many revolutionary features and deserved to fare better. Hawkins had enjoyed a long, successful and respected career in gaming, which boded well for any new hardware ventures. He was, after all, the founder of the publishing giant Electronic Arts. It's worth noting this was when they actually published games worth caring about, from Mule in the early days through to many Mega Drive favourites. He explained the history behind 3DO. Fundamentally, I had just in 1990 made a breakthrough deal with Sega that I knew would drive EA's growth through to 1994. But I was concerned by a lack of initiative from the hardware platform companies. The business models, the lack of graphics power, the lack of optical disc storage all suggested the market would stall. 3DO was an effort to do something about it, to be a catalyst for better business models, graphics and optical storage. For the best funding story, read the WSJ story that ran in January 1993. The company began as a project inside EA, boasted by a development contract with New Technologies Group. 3DO was later spun out as a separate company and actually acquired NTG. As for the meaning behind the name, he tells us, "The name was the result of me wanting it to end in O, along with video, radio, etc., and someone else suggesting putting 3D in front of it." NTG was led by Dave Needle and included RJ McCall, both of whom had previously worked on creating Atari's Lynx handheld. And it was the team that went on to design the 3DO specifications. Here things get very interesting. Since the project tried to kickstart a revolution that had already been attempted previously with the MSX range of systems, the goal had been to produce a single common design, which could be licensed out to manufacturers. In effect, a single unified format. According to Tripp, the hardware side of things used $100 million in capital, even though the 3DO company never actually built any of the systems. The goal speaks for itself, but it failed because we were all ahead of the market in using some technologies that drove up the cost, and setting the license fees so generously low made it impossible to fix the problem. Those licensing the technology from manufacturing were global companies. Each would produce compatible systems according to 3DO's original specifications, while in some cases adding a personal touch. Machines sold in Japan came with additional memory and had their native character scripts built in. But at this early stage, decisions were made that would come back to haunt Tripp. The big obstacles, in hindsight, were that I set the software license fee too low at $3 per disc, which prevented us from funding enough marketing and subsidy of hardware pricing. And we used a lot of RAM and a CD-ROM drive when it was still a tad expensive for the latter, and a weird period where RAM costs actually went up, instead of following Moore's law. The new technology drove up the cost while the low licensing fees meant that Tripp couldn't offset the problem. The generosity in licensing also didn't benefit them as expected. Ironically, software companies did not really appreciate the generously low license fees. First, they complained that the fees were still too high, and then they jumped in bed with Sony and Sega immediately and agreed to pay fees that were 3 times higher to them. Software companies were paranoid about who would sell enough hardware units. So, they bet on all the horses, but only 3DO suffered from being unable to fund its business by setting the license fees too low, explains Hawkins. Meanwhile, the honourable decision to omit territory lockouts, making it region-free, like many decisions, were based on giving consumers the best deal and what they should have wanted. As Hawkins puts it, what we thought was the right thing for the world and for the public. It shows you just how far you can go in the real world with such idealism. And he's right, of course, since it was the greedy Japanese corporations with the incessant need for global control that ended up winning the console wars. The idealism of creating a single format where you could play games from anywhere in the world arguably died with the 3DO. As for the ingenious multi-linking control pad design that also incorporated a headphone socket, that was the key guys at NTG, led by Dave Needle. I encouraged them by pushing the social value of having lots of people playing off one machine in one room, and they were very clever in solving that problem elegantly. The solution was to allow each additional controller to be connected to the previous one, forming a daisy chain. This must surely stand as the most phenomenal design decisions in the history of gaming, removing the need for multi-taps, and one that sadly has never been copied. With the designs complete and the 3DO looking set to take over the world, the press and in turn the public went into hysteria. Magazines reported on the unveiling at various trade shows and gave large amounts of coverage, hyping the system to incredible levels. You must remember, at the time the two most visually impressive consoles were the Neo Geo and SNES. So the bold claims being made were revolutionary. One publication even imprudently went as far as dedicating its entire front cover, stating that the 3DO was the future. The system launched in September 1993 and was way ahead of other hardware, both in terms of capabilities and price, the latter being something few were happy with. This was because of Matsushita, the first licensed manufacturer. 3DO themselves had no way of regulating pricing, leaving consumers at the whim of the manufacturing partners. But as Tripp explains, the situation was complicated. It was entirely Matsushita's decision since they were the debut supplier. Many articles say the initial price was $799, but in fact it was really $699 when launched in September 1993. It was down to $499 by February 1994, but in a way it had already acquired a reputation by then of being too expensive. But Sony introduced the PlayStation at a similar price later in that year in Japan. Despite the high prices and delayed titles, it didn't stop people salivating over and yearning to play games like Crash and Burn or Need for Speed. It's easy to forget the atmosphere of the era, but there was nothing else like it at the time, and so people were justifiably excited. With later additions such as memory units, adapters that enabled VCD playback, arcade sticks and many other oddities like hotel pay-per-play systems in Japan only, not to mention numerous games, the future seemed bright.